Welcome, everybody. I think we've started the webinar. It's the first webinar that the Martin Marty Center for the Public Understanding of Religion organizes this year, but the first in its history. My name is Willemien Otten, and I'm the director of the Martin Marty Center. And my co-host here is Daniel Owings, who is director of Sightings, and he will assist with the fielding of questions in the latter half of the session. I'm very honored to have a number of distinguished guests, and I will just make a round of our guests, and in a more formal way, after that, we've agreed that we will be on a first name basis to just get into the debate. So our first guest is Professor Kristen Kobus-Dumes, who's a professor of history at Calvin University in Grand Rapids. And she's the author of the recent book, Jesus and John Wayne, How White Evangelicals Corrupted a Faith and Fractured a Nation, right? That came out in 2020. Our next guest is Professor Anthea Butler, who is a professor of religious studies and Africana studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also, she told me, co-chair of Catholics for Biden. And she's author of the forthcoming book, White Evangelical Racism, The Politics of Morality in America, coming out in March 2021. Next, we have Professor Rick Rosengarten, who is former dean of the Divinity School. He's an alum also of the Divinity School and a professor of religion and literature currently in the Divinity School. With his great administrative experience, he has one of the most finely grained view of the landscape of religious education in the US, I would say. Then we have Dr. Rob Wilson Black, who's also an alum of the Divinity School, and I believe an alum studied with Martin Marty. He is chair currently of the Alumni Council of the Divinity School. And in his daily life, he is CEO of the journal magazine Sojourners. And he's also, very interestingly, founding board chair of the National Museum of American Religion and author of the forthcoming 2021 Fortress book, The End of College. And finally, last but not least, we have Dr. Will Schultz, who is an incoming faculty member in the Divinity School in Religions in the Americas. He is a recent PhD from Princeton University, and he has a forthcoming book called Jesus Springs, How Colorado Springs Became the Capital of the Culture Wars. He's incoming because he's this year currently a fellow at Harvard's Charles Warren Center. So with that said, we have agreed to a certain order that we go in to ask panelists to speak to the problem of, as we said in the invite, if this election is a battle for the soul of the American nation, what about the religious division that is plaguing us all? And is religion only a force for division, or can it also still be a force for unity? And we've asked all the panelists to come at this problem from their own angle so that we get an array of different viewpoints on the table, after which the discussion can begin. So I'll first ask Professor Kobus-Dumes to start with her take on this for about 5 minutes.
Sure, thank you. So I'm talking about white evangelicals in particular. And of course, when it comes to religion and the election, it's not just white evangelicals who matter. And so I'm glad to be a part of this larger panel. But that's really the focus of my research. And of course, in 2016, we saw somewhere around 81% of white evangelicals end up supporting Donald Trump. And at the time, of course, that caused a lot of, provoked a lot of commentary. And there was shock. One of the narratives was that this somehow represented a betrayal of evangelical values, or that this was purely transactional and that many evangelicals were holding their noses to vote for President Trump. And my own research that focused on gender and evangelical masculinity in particular suggested that this perhaps was not the case, that this was not a betrayal of evangelical values, and that many evangelicals were not, in fact, holding their noses to vote for somebody like Donald Trump. My research into a decades-long history of the linkages between evangelical masculinity and militarism suggested that when it comes to family values evangelicalism, we really have to understand a kind of militant white patriarchy at the heart of that ideology. And once we see that, then we're not looking at this huge disconnect between, moral values voters or family values voters and the support of somebody like Donald Trump. Instead, we can see that a longstanding embrace of kind of understanding the role of the masculine protector, of understanding the kind of militancy and militarism that is required to defend family and nation, and that God has in fact equipped men with testosterone in order that they can do this and do this well. That's when we can understand that somebody like Donald Trump could enter the stage in 2016 at a time when evangelicals felt that they were particularly besieged and becoming increasingly marginalized, that they could find the strong masculine leader that they had been trained and primed to look for in somebody like Donald Trump, and that he was in fact the best candidate for the job precisely because he had not been deeply formed by particular Christian virtues, say the fruits of the Spirit, or loving your neighbor as yourself, or loving your enemy and turning the other cheek. And so when it comes to evangelical support for the president in this moment, we see a lot of resilience there. We're looking at around 77% at this point in terms of survey data, and that resiliency has really continued through his entire presidency. So again, we should not be looking at, questions of betrayal or how could this be, but instead understanding how support for the president is in fact very consistent with an ideology that they have held dear. And with respect to your opening question, it is an ideology that this militancy kind of requires an us versus them mentality. And so it is very hard to embrace ideas like the common good within this ideology. And so it's not a cause for a lot of hope in terms of the political polarization that we find ourselves in right now. And the evangelicals themselves are in fact deeply divided around precisely these lines. Right now, and are likely to be even more so after the November election.
Thank you so much. It's so amazing to me that it's exactly the outsider position of Trump, not being reared in a Christian home, say, or ostensibly Christian home, that makes him so attractive. Anthea, can I ask you to go next with your statement? You're muted at the moment.
Sorry, I was trying to be careful there. If we're going to think about what it means to be fighting for the soul of the nation, as Biden has on the back of his bus, then I think the question about the soul of the nation revolves around not just religion, but race. And what we have seen this summer with the death of George Floyd, the protest about Breonna Taylor, and others have really emphasized the fractures that we have already had in this country. For the past 4 years, we've had a president who has not made any, let's put it like this, no apology whatsoever for what it is that he believes and what he supports. And that, alongside the fact that he uses that support of white supremacy alongside of religion, I think is an important factor for us to look at and to consider. One of the things I think is really interesting about this election cycle is the ways in which I think it is reconfigured the religious framework of America. For, a long time, we've talked about the role of evangelicals in politics from, the late 60s on forward. We've talked about the ways in which Catholics and evangelicals have come together to work on certain kinds of issues. But I think now we have a different kind of question. And I think that question is something like this. What does it look like when evangelicals have left behind every moral issue that they possibly could have said, and that white Catholics have joined together with them, and it's everybody else against these two groups? And so I think the issue of race becomes a very crucial one and very important for the ways in which we begin to look at what has happened in the 2020 election cycle. It is pretty clear to me that the fundamentals that we thought were around were not very much around. Everybody during the Obama administration wanted to say that racism was over and we were in this post-racial world. And that post-racial world turned out to be the most racist world that you could possibly want to be in. And that has fallen out between religious lines. And it's also made things very difficult when you want to try to cut through, or when churches want to try to cut through and say, well, we're really not like this. Because on the one hand, what you have is this talk about, oh, we're equal, we want to see the American dream, we want to do all of these things. But the reality is we still have some religious leaders like Robert Jefferson and others who have put themselves right behind the president, who have, basically signed on to white supremacist beliefs. And they don't look any different than the Citizens Council of the 1950s. Mm-hmm. So that's one way to sort of look at the election cycle. The other way to look at the election cycle, if you want to be an optimist, is to say, well, what about all the other churches? What is happening with everybody else? And I think this is where we need to get a little bit more savvy about what's happening. And I want to talk about that in two ways. One, if we think about the normal moniker of the Black church, then what does that mean in this election cycle? In other words, how do we start to think about African American religion as a way in which to see the changes that are happening? So I just want to point out a couple of things that I think have been really stand out to me. One is these articles that have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and others about African Americans leaving interracial churches. It is very clear to me that there are profound problems with this. And if we want to think about this in terms of, and I'll use this because it's the Divinity School, a missions imperative. If you go back to thinking about Donald McGavran and all this about what you think about a church is, then what it's pointing to is that interracial churches are no longer cutting it anymore for people of color, and they're having to leave because of these deeply held embedded racial beliefs and truths and political action, okay? So that's one thing. The second thing I think is also really important is that we have not taken into account Latinos either from the Catholic perspective, from an evangelical perspective, or from a straight up Protestant perspective. And I think that's a miss in this election cycle, because I see them in the next 2 weeks as being a very crucial group in terms of what's going to happen with this and how they see themselves vis-a-vis what the American dream is, what the American nightmare is on the border with immigration, and how they sort of fit in with that. And then the third thing I think that's really important is how do we talk about liberal Protestantism? There's been a big argument on Twitter between some of us, religious history people and journalists about what is the role of religious liberalism during this time period. And I think, and this is where I bring up the X factor here of the pandemic. But the last thing that I wanted to say was that liberal Protestantism has had a resurgence. We haven't talked about people like Reverend Dr. William Barber and others who have been, Guthrie Graves Fitzsimmons and others who have been out here on the front lines doing things. And I think that's to our neglect that we haven't paid attention to groups like this who have been very active in this election cycle. And I think will be very active as we go forward in thinking about what religion is going to look like during the rest of the pandemic and post-pandemic.
Thank you. And sorry about the chat problem.
That's all right.
But the Latino vote is indeed very inscrutable at the moment. And that's maybe a segue to Rick, who I will ask to speak next.
Thanks, Wilhelmine, and thanks for having me here, and warm greetings to my fellow panelists, some old friends and some new acquaintances who, with any luck, will become old friends. So my assignment is to bring a perspective about Catholicism to the panel, and I think I'll just make 3 points. The first is to say that the history of modern Catholicism is, I think, well encapsulated by what I would call bipolarity of the First and Second Vatican Councils. The First Council, 1869 to 1871, regarded modernity as anathema and set up very strict walls between church and state and set up very separate notions of authority. The Second Council, 1962 to 65, published documents like The Church in the Modern World and talked about a kind of conciliarity, shall we say, between the church and the world and modernity. What these stand for really are the building blocks of what I think is just an iterative tension in modern Catholicism. And it's one that the Second Council did not fully resolve. Witness the journals Communio and Collegium, both of which have had a flourishing publishing history since the Council. The ongoing turbulence regarding the liturgy and the vernacular, particularly among Anglophone Catholics, and the contrastive papacies of Benedict and Francis most recently. Institutional Catholicism has never quite made up its mind about modernity and that staple institution of modernity, the nation state. If there are ambiguities in Catholic voting, I think they run very deep, in fact. The second point I would make concerns the assimilation of Catholics in America. This is the immigrant church par excellence of an immigrant nation. Catholics today inhabit all of the socioeconomic categories of American society. Catholic voting, to the degrees that polls are reliable, and I am not a social scientist, reflect these categories. There are white suburban Catholics, there are Hispanic and African American Catholics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Historically, the Catholic vote in America was really only unified twice, for John Fitzgerald Kennedy in 1960 and for Lyndon Baines Johnson in 1964. Otherwise, the best we can know from the polls is that Catholic votes have approximated a kind of 40-40-20 formula, Republican, Democrat, and undecided. There have been some close elections when the pundits have argued that how that 20% vote really does matter. I can find very little evidence that clearly demonstrates that that would be the case. But that's what you have. You have a church that is divided on this issue, I think. The third point I would want to make is one that concerns something that's been often talked about, but probably matters as much in this election as in any election. And that's the perduring gap, really, between church authority and Catholics in the pews, although a significant number of people who identify as Catholics do not regularly attend Mass. Dennis Costello's work demonstrates this really beautifully, the whole question of how Mass attendance is counted. The gap is most dramatic and most remarked upon with respect to sexual conduct, but it is not difficult to locate on other issues. You have on the one hand cardinals such as Dolan, Chaput, and Burke, who speak GOP. You have nuns on a bus and the Jesuit Volunteer Corps who sound like Bernie Bros. The gap has become an even more predominant theme in this election cycle when we see commentators for the first time in my experience, at least, and I'm thinking especially of people like E.J. Dionne, who observe this division, but speak more publicly and aggressively than they ever have, in my experience, about a church leadership that is risking moral bankruptcy and even the most seeming alliance with Donald Trump's reelection. So I think is the soul of the American nation at stake? Is religion a force for division or unity? I'm not really sure what to say about that vis-a-vis the Catholic vote, because I think the Catholic vote has always been, with two exceptions, radically divided. But I will say that one of the ways to think about the Catholic vote in this election is to think about what is the discrepancy between the leadership and the people who identify as Catholic, but are largely, I think, alienated from the pews.
Thank you. Yeah, I had a Catholic friend tell me that he thought this election was a dumpster fire because on the one hand you had Joe Biden, on the other hand you had Amy Coney Barrett, and he didn't know how to pull those together as Catholic positions. We'll go to Rob next, please. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you, Professor Otten. It's great to be on this esteemed panel. I think of elections as a stress test for democracy. Sort of presently, 45% of Americans are hoping the president passes the stress test, and 55% are hoping the country's institutions, norms, and ideals pass the test. Elections are also stress tests for pollsters, and we may discover that pollsters have incorrectly divined this 45-55 breakdown. Faith communities have been given a rare gift in the past 4 years. They're blessed to learn exactly how much their politics was really about morality, ethnic superiority, sexual purity, civility, humanity, and raw power. And when reaching for their candidate, deal breakers were few and far between. And for some, that forced a serious look in the mirror, and for others, forced a look away from the mirror. So political parties are often rediscovering religion via the exit polling after a defeat. And that is, of course, too late. Democrats have in recent decades tended to struggle with clear, effective public messages about religion and are unfortunately taken less seriously even when they do. Republicans often bring their focus on religion earlier and more often, and it becomes an effective identity marker. I'm reminded of the president's recent words, quote, "With Biden, there's no religion, no anything. He'll hurt the Bible, hurt God. He's against God." In national elections, Democrats typically must span a larger chasm than the Republicans when it comes to faith voter issues. A focus on white Christian America is often enough of a focus in running a national Republican campaign, while Democrats must attend to the non-religiously affiliated with ultra-liberal social values, as well as non-white Christians who are troubled by those same ultra-liberal values. There are four key categories in polling that seem to matter right now regarding religion. The first is U.S. religious makeup. So Catholics are down to 12%. White Catholics are. Latino Catholics down to 7%. It's kind of flat over the last 10 years. Black Protestants down from 9 to 7%. Non-evangelical white Protestants moved from 17 down to 13%. And white evangelicals, 19% to 16%. The second category is religious makeup within the party. So 60% of Republicans are white Christians, 26% of Democrats are white Christians. And white Christians, 59% down to 44%, shift since 2008. And the third is religious groups themselves. So 55% of all Christians were polling for Trump and 43% Biden. White evangelicals are 17% Biden, 82% Trump. Black Protestants are 88% Biden, 8% Trump. And Catholics are fascinating as always, 52% Biden, 47% Trump. Although if you just take out white Catholics, it's majority Trump. Presidential approval is the last category. This is what the most interesting category for me. From April, there's been an 8% drop in white evangelical Christian support for the president. It's pretty dramatic. 6% white Protestant non-evangelical. Black Protestants, surprising 21% approval rating down to 12%, and Latino Catholics, 28% down to 23%. Here's an interesting note, which most folks may know, but white mainline Protestants are not politically liberal. White mainline Protestants usually vote about 57% Republican. And of course, Mormon polling is very striking at the moment, moving towards Biden, a story we may be familiar with. It's much harder today than even 4 elections ago for a candidate to implement what we always call audience appropriate messaging, right? Because when the president or Biden says to one group today, it can be known by all groups 20 minutes later. Candidates can no longer talk one way to an AME Zion church in South Carolina and to a predominantly white Southern Baptist church in Texas with completely different messages. It all ends up on Twitter, Reddit, Steemit, Vero, Lasso, Instagram, TikTok, or YouTube. And if you don't know half of those, it means you're not under 50. So social media is also a much quicker way to reach your followers if you lose a contested election, quicker than, say, the election commission or the courts. It's minutes versus months. The biggest religious issues in 2020 election seem to me to be racial equality, white supremacy, of course, exacerbated by bad Christian white theology and redeemed by better theology, I hope. The second is religious freedom and practice, variously identified and defined. And then finally, pro-life, consistent ethic of life, shorthand being abortion. Interestingly enough, abortion was not the main concern in founding of the religious right. That was segregated Christian schools. I'm old enough to have been there for both of those. Abortion back then was considered a Catholic issue and therefore irrelevant or distasteful to bring up. To put this more philosophically, if government is the name we give to that which we've decided to do together, and say politics is a way of determining what we owe one another, then elections are our way of sort of displaying who my group is, so that my group can be in charge of determining what we do together to answer the question of what we owe one another. In reviewing the role of religion in this election, we try to keep it simple and use an acronym, FLOWS. How is religion a filter, a lens or lever, an object, a wedge, or a surrogate? It's a filter for polling, a lens for values mapping, a lever for activists, an object for those trying to study its effects, and a wedge for those who primarily care for its utility, and finally a surrogate for those who track its correlation to other characteristics of your group or who need a proxy for their category. So how religion flows is a kind of a interpretive framework that I use. In conclusion, one big mystery of 2020 is how the none of the aboves will vote. 20% of Americans who now check nothing in particular, although some may be what you call cultural Christians and not interested in institutional Christianity or religion, but they don't just believe in nothing per se. They voted significantly for Trump in 3 big states last election: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. Those states are very familiar to us. This group is growing. They are not all white, and they matter. Our main focus at Sojourners right now is ensuring voter protection and voter encouragement, working with something we created called Lawyers and Collars at the Polls. That includes rabbis now as of last week, so they can attend to the polls and work on voter protection. And for Turnout Sunday with Barbara Williams Skinner, a great partner of ours. And while we're nonpartisan at Sojourners, our values are very clear. Preventing someone to vote degrades the imago Dei, the image of God in them. And our post-election work is also ramping up, given the various scenarios that could unfold after the election. And they are complicated, and you know many of them. And I can place resources in the chat from Sojourners, but I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Great. Thank you so much. This was a very comprehensive position. Can I invite Will to go next?
Absolutely. It is a pleasure to be here, albeit in a virtual sense. And I think my comments are going to build off something that Rob brought up about the role of people with no religious affiliation in the 2020 election. And for a long time, this was a very, very small constituency in American politics, especially when you compare the United States to other industrialized nations in Northwest Europe and East Asia. But over the past 2 decades, the number of religiously unaffiliated Americans has grown rapidly. And according to the latest Pew report, admittedly an imperfect source, but the best we have, about a quarter of Americans are now religiously unaffiliated. About a third of this group actively identifies as atheist or agnostic. The other 2/3 say they are nothing in particular. Now, like most groups which are not white Christians, this constituency looks likely to vote for Joe Biden over Donald Trump. But this is, as Rob said, a diverse constituency. And there's no guarantee that it will become a reliable Democratic bloc. In terms of the divisions within the group, people who actively identify as atheists or agnostics are often more affluent, higher levels of education. Those who simply say the religion is nothing in particular are more likely to have lower levels of education and income. Again, that's speaking very broadly, very general terms. And they are less likely to be committed Democrats. The political scientist Ryan Burge recently had an excellent piece about these nothing in particulars published in the Religion News Service. So the key question then, as I understand it, is whether this nothing in particular group, which is likely to only grow in size as we go ahead, will it attach itself as firmly to the Democratic Party as evangelical Christians have, as white evangelical Christians have to the Republican Party? Or will it be a contested group, the way Roman Catholics are now, and as Rick so nicely detailed? The former, becoming a reliable Democratic bloc, seems a bit more likely, given that the growth of this non-affiliated bloc is in many ways a response to the increasing religiosity of the Republican Party in the United States. There's been lots of good social scientific work on this topic. Social scientists like Robert Putnam, David Campbell, Michelle Margolis have shown that as the Christian right has grown stronger in the Republican Party, many previously religious people have abandoned religion altogether because they see it as too political, too conservative. But nothing is guaranteed in politics, and there's no guarantee that this group will become reliably Democratic. And I think the fate of this group, the political fate of this group, depends on what the next generation of politicians and activists looks like. At the moment, people with no religious affiliation are very much underrepresented in American politics. Now, that's not so shocking among Republicans, but even among Democrats, many of the rising stars in the party, people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Pete Buttigieg, are themselves avowedly religious and make their religion a part of their, to put it bluntly, brand. Now, this situation makes me think of the position that evangelical Christians were in prior to the 1970s. They took part in politics, but were not well organized. But from the 1970s onward, activists, people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, and eventually elected officials like Jesse Helms, a senator from North Carolina, helped to mobilize and organize white evangelicals into a reliably Republican voting bloc. It remains to be seen whether anything similar will happen with these religious nuns, N-O-N-E-S, just to clarify. There are various ways it could happen. For instance, they might be motivated to organize on the basis of their religious non-affiliation in response to perhaps future rulings of the Supreme Court, in the same way that the Warren Court's rulings against teacher-led prayer and Bible readings in public schools mobilized evangelicals. But that, of course, is in the future. For now, it seems as if neither party has fully reckoned with what these demographic changes might mean for their constituencies and policies. And I think we have yet to see a good answer to what will happen when this question of a battle for the soul of America, and I'm hopeful our conversation will help address that.
Thank you. Before we continue, I first want to apologize profusely to Professor Butler for the terrible chats that came in. That has not happened before, but we have no experience. I got some also messages from the audience that they want you to know that you have a lot of allies in the audience. So I feel I'm conveying the full sentiment of the entire audience that this is awful. And I have no words for it. And I'm deeply ashamed.
Thank you. Although I have to say it proves my point about everything, right?
It does. And
I mean, Exhibit A.
Yes, absolutely. And I'd heard about that, but to be honest, I'd never really experienced it in this way. And just within a few minutes, there we go. So I'm deeply ashamed. I really am. And you have my deepest sympathy This should not have happened.
Thank you.
But we should continue the discussion. And I think it's so interesting to have you and Professor Kristen, I should say, to have you and Kristen here together talking about evangelicals. So let me start with you, Anthea. So if Trump is sort of appreciated because he's the outsider in a way, they don't care whether he's crass or whatever because he still protects. How does race figure in all of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, one of the things that I have missed in all of this conversation when I read people like Peter Wenner and others is that there is a ignoring of race. We assume that evangelical means white and that we talk about it from a white perspective. We don't think about, any brown or black evangelicals that might exist, first of all. But second, we also have to understand that the kinds of things that evangelicals support, whether that be, under the guise of law and order, let's say, or education and all these are things that have been actually antithetical to the gains of the civil rights movement. So when we talk about, Rick brought up the whole thing, I believe it was Rick or Rob, one of you brought up the whole thing about Bob Jones and that this wasn't about abortion, but this was about, schooling. And it was also about being able to not have different people of color be involved at Bob Jones University. So that's one. I'm thinking actually back much further than that. And my forthcoming book talks about this from basically slavery on forward, is that evangelicals had a certain story about themselves. That story has been, we're great. We were abolitionists. We brought, education to Black and brown peoples of the world. We did missions work. We did all this stuff. And then we had Billy Graham. And wasn't Billy Graham great with Martin Luther King? Not really. How did we deal with everything in the post-civil rights movement? We just all got along on televangelism, right? Until the Reagan administration. And then we decided that we needed to go full bore into that. And, we're kind of sorry for race because we did these racial reconciliation things, but we don't really quite understand why you don't like us anymore. But Trump, right? And so, when you get to this point and you don't know what this history is, or you buy into the evangelical histories that have been written, then you bought the lie. And you bought the lie that says that evangelicals have always been good. No, they're not. They are after their political gains, and they are about being white. And when you understand whiteness, you understand evangelicalism. You get it. And I don't mean that to be mean. I was trained in the evangelical seminary. I was trained at Fuller. I get it. I realize what that means. And I realize what it is to be a Black person entering into that world and not being able to fit in and having to leave it because of that.
Yeah. Kristen, do you see any room for improvement on the horizon, or is Anthea's statement about the situation kind of how things are and there's little room for change?
I absolutely agree with how Anthea characterized this situation, and I cannot wait for your book, Anthea. And you're right. The story that white evangelicals tell themselves is one where they are the heroes. And, so William Wilberforce, best-selling books about that. And evangelicals are always the good guys versus the bad guys. And so that's their narrative that they tell themselves, which is why it's so startling and offensive when confronted with stories that are suggesting that they are holding views or promoting policies that are racist, or that they might actually harbor racist sentiments themselves. What we see is that when it comes to addressing race, it's often very subtle within white evangelical communities. And so in my research, I discovered that family values, again, what's closer to the heart of evangelical identity, white evangelical identity, than family values. But when you look at what was actually happening, yes, you have school desegregation, and you have evangelicals mobilizing around what? Parental authority. parental authority over against the big government, intervening government that was undermining the authority of the parents, meaning the patriarch, the white patriarch. There was no talk of the authority of Black parents to do what was best for their children, right? And so this racial subtext is absolutely there, but it is not front and center, and it's very much not in the stories that they're telling themselves about themselves. And that's why it's really hard to talk about race in white evangelical identity. I mean, when it came to their visions of masculinity, the same thing held true. I saw in all of these hundreds of books on Christian manhood that were published over and over again. Again, they love their heroes. They are always white men, and often white men who are asserting violence against non-white populations, cowboys, right? John Wayne. And so here too, they're very heroes. It's all about this kind of white law and order, enforcing order against non-white threats internally or externally on the world stage. And so once you start to really look at, again, the stories that they tell themselves, you can see why it's so difficult to have these honest and necessary conversations about race. And for that reason, at this point, I don't see much hope for change. I see a very real stalemate. And in fact, both sides are kind of digging in their heels because, again, many white evangelicals are extremely offended at, accusations that they may be harboring racism or inadvertently or intentionally promoting white supremacy.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask Kristen a question to follow up?
Go ahead.
I just want to ask you one thing. And I thought it was really interesting when you were describing this part of masculinity. And you made me think about something that we haven't really talked about, but I think is sort of tied to this. Do you think that this idea about masculinity also gets formed through the way in which you think about sports? So I'm thinking like up to this time, sports have been a way to bring Black men in to this conversation about masculinity, if you're thinking about Promise Keepers and all of that, right?
Yeah.
But now with what happened with Trump and the NFL, it changed everything. And I think that was sort of this kind of interesting moment. I'd just be interested to hear what you have to say about that.
Yeah, sports has always been this kind of space where, yes, it's a place where men can practice masculinity. There are analogies between sports and the military, right? It's kind of a battle, but sports is kind of the kinder, gentler version, or at least the less militant, less overtly militant version. Whether it's the same thing in a different guise is open for debate. But you're right. In the 1990s, that's when we have this brief moment of intentional, quote unquote, racial reconciliation within the Promise Keepers, and sports was really a place where that played out. That said, when I've looked at white evangelical discourse on masculinity, anytime that militancy is celebrated, that is an exclusively white ideal. So Black men, they might be a great athlete, but as soon as that shifts over into any kind of militancy, militarism, then the militancy of men of color is actually a danger that needs to be guarded against, protected against. And so I would say that would be a common motif, and that would certainly now be being reinforced in terms of the NFL, in terms of Black Lives Matter, and so that would be the consistency there, I would suggest.
Thank you.
You're muted, Anthea.
Thank you. I was just saying thank you, and thank you for letting me interrupt.
Is there any of the other panelists who would like to weigh in on this issue? Because I think it's fascinating, but it's sad if there's such a stalemate.
When I think about progress and where we're heading, I sort of think about two takes on the rot or bigotry in the American election season. One is sort of, this is not who we are as Americans or people of faith. I mean, descriptively or rhetorically, sure, but that's not really who we are, right? And the second one is descriptively and historically, yes, the president, religious leaders backing him are very much in line with the policy, values, ideas wise with our history. The president is perhaps stylistically, but not substantively, a radical departure from the past. So, which of it is these? Which of these are really the truth of it? I guess there's significant truth in each perspective. And yet it kind of reminds me of when I was researching a little bit of Trump supporters on talk radio. this one guy said, you know what? I don't know much about the Jews, but I can tell you this. If they have their version of the 10 Commandments, I wish they'd follow them. And so it takes you back to sort of how far do you have to go into various levels of education or exposure to the other. But which is it? Is it the first? That's not really who we are in America, or it's very much who we are. And we've just had a closer look at it during these last 4 years. I'd be curious if anybody has any thoughts on that.
I guess I would just say that I think the vice president is a metonym for a lot of this in an interesting way. I find him endlessly vexing, but I thought the debate was really interesting on that score. Actually, Pence's Vice President Pence is classically someone who debates by saying as little as possible. But in that debate, he talked over both his opponent and the moderator quite consistently. And, I guess I would say this much. I would say that to the degree that Pence is a metonym for the evangelical community, there's a question there about whether they can fill the leadership positions or whether they always have to be in the position of voting for or against someone in major positions like this. Because, I think the aw shucks kind of, I'll say as little as I know and wink and invoke Dred Scott and it'll be okay thing. That's not, I don't think that's going to work for Pence myself. So maybe one of the things in terms of the country to think a little bit about is whether the white evangelical community has to be, as it were, a voting bloc as opposed to a bloc that fills major leadership roles like president and vice president. I don't know. It's a thought.
He was a Democrat and a Roman Catholic up into early adulthood, right?
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
He was.
Yep.
Just one thing I'd say on the broader question of race and racism within the realm of evangelical Christianity, looking back to a relatively recent moment in history, the early 1990s, one of the intriguing things you saw there was how some white evangelical political activists had this ambition to create an alliance with African American church leaders and religious activists over the question of gay rights. One of their key arguments was that gay people are not real minorities and are thus trying to steal recognition and resources from the true minorities of African Americans. This was part of the great hope among a lot of evangelical leaders in the 1990s, that this question of sexuality could allow them to forge a religious movement that would cross racial lines, would at least get some support among African American churches. The very idea of a culture war is based in part on that, bringing together all religious people against a common enemy, secularism, or in the case of the 1990s, homosexuals and gay rights activists. And obviously that never really came to pass. So, and that's another case where I think the kind of changing religious demographics have played a key role as the number of people of any race who identified as religious starts to decrease. This idea of a culture war uniting all evangelicals of all races becomes less practicable. So that's just one moment where this dream that they had foundered.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really. Anyone who wants to react to this? Otherwise, no, sorry, please, Rick.
May I ask a question? Because I'm curious about this and I don't know what to think about it. Is there a difference between someone who identifies as a nun and someone who identifies as nothing in particular?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that's been a shift in the way questions are asked in two different major areas. Will or others, Krista may, I don't know, Anthea may know this as well. But there's a way in which they've changed it to nothing in particular from none of the above. And the question regarding that is contested that, on some days, Rob Wilson Black will say nothing in particular because I'm not really feeling at home in any particular, church or moment. And that's too broad. And that's where we get to the 20-25%. That is a critique of the way the question is asked. And then there's another polling group, which others may know better than I, the distinctions between them, like the difference between a NORC and a Pew, who have asked it in a different way. So,
okay, thank you.
We're tracking it.
Will, do you want to add to that, or?
Rob covered it pretty well, but yeah, so much we know, what we know, not only about the nuns or religiously non-affiliated, but about all other religious communities.
Yes.
Evangelical, mainline, conservative, so much of that is a creation of survey data and the way that it's framed. And that's just the way we have to do things. It's the best possible way we have at the moment, but it's always really important not to confuse those for the totality of the religious landscape.
8% of atheists believe in God, and that's from the data. So yeah, it's true. And so you got to take it all with a little bit of a grain of salt.
I would add too, in connection with thinking about the nuns or nothing in particular, and thinking about too the declining numbers of religious folks, and in terms of white evangelicals, so shrinking numbers, but potentially then as those on the margins exit, radicalizing of the base that remains. And I've certainly observed this anecdotally. I know that Ruth Brownstein has observed this, has quantified some of this as a phenomenon that is occurring. And I think that is absolutely going to be accelerated. We tend to focus on kind of young evangelicals leaving the faith. I'm seeing it now like I have never seen before among older white evangelicals. So the 19%, if you will. It was hard enough in 2016. It is much more. This polarization, right, is going both ways. Just yesterday, my local newspaper published a story about a pastor in my denomination in his 50s who is leaving his job, leaving the denomination because of the level of Trump support in the Christian Reformed Church. And I just talked with a mom on the playground at my children's Christian school this afternoon. And she said, I don't know that I can hold on to my faith anymore because of what I'm seeing around me, and ready to walk away. And I'm hearing that from so many people, again, not just the young generation. And so I would expect these trends to accelerate, even regardless of the November election result, but in the midst of this polarization is only increasing.
Yeah,
I think this is where I would say just quickly that the thing that Trump revealed is that the genteel racism is over, right? You could be racist and be just as nice and polite and be nice and polite to everybody you want it to be. But this kind of in-your-face racism and the constant assaults that he has kind of created, and along with the anxiety of the pandemic in the last few months, I think is part of the reason why you see all these people leaving, because it's a psychic break for people. Like, they can't hold on to things the same way they could. They're being confronted in a different kind of way about their faith and about their beliefs and about what they considered to be normal. It's not normal anymore.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I wanted to ask another question, and all of you can chime in. So reading some of Will's mentor, Kevin Cruz, One Nation Under God, about evangelicals and money, I was struck by how, say, in the 40s and the 50s, Roosevelt would mobilize religion. You know, religion was more an item on the left than on the right. But that really shifted. And although people like, Carter, of course, you had, but Obama was also very nuanced about religion and race. Nuance doesn't seem to cut it anymore in religion, right? You have to be in your face, you have to be radical. And then apparently what only survives is that crassness on the right. Is there any way that religion could be brought back into the discourse, but in a more nuanced way? And then not only being aligned with a conservative position, but be mobilized for other goals? Or has the train just left that station and we're never going to have a nuanced hold on religion back again?
There's that page in Bob Putnam's book where the chart goes just like this, showing the correlation of church attendance and being a Democrat is much more likely before X date in the 70s. So you're so right. Can it come back? That's tough to say. I'm still trying to put my head around in that regard, white American Christianity, and the fact that how many presidential candidates in our lifetime have not expressed their followers of Jesus of Nazareth, a first century Jewish fisherman from Palestine. Just putting those two things together is always interesting, always takes me back to the Carter interview in Playboy, where the worlds collide. So white Christian America colliding with a Jesus of Nazareth, first century Jewish fisherman from Palestine, and Jimmy Carter's Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher colliding with Hugh Hefner's world. Always fascinating.
Yeah.
I think the money is really important to think about here. And I think one of the limitations of those on the left, and the religious left in particular, is not having the massive donor base that's linked to the defense and promotion of free market capitalism. And so I just need to acknowledge that. And if you follow the money, I mean, the money is enormous. And then you also have the question of ideology. Yes. So nuance is harder to sell. And fear is really helpful for driving donations and for preserving loyalty and for consolidating power. And that was certainly a theme that jumped out at me looking at the past decades of white evangelical religious organizations and political organizations, right? This us versus them at any given moment, right? We are embattled, we are besieged. The fate of Christian America is on the line, the fate of your children, of your family, right? And so that really does tend to generate partisan loyalty, and it does generate an awful lot of donations as well. And so when I think about, what could perhaps the religious left do to be more successful in mobilizing, I run into this kind of problem, both of the kind of big corporate donors that could support this, and also what kind of rhetoric could demand the kind of sacrifice and loyalty that would be necessary to build the kind of mobilization effort that they might need. And if in fact you achieve that, have you not kind of defeated your whole purpose, right? Is the ideology itself incompatible with that sort of political mobilization? And then that leads me to certain levels of despair.
Yes. Yeah. Anyone else who wants to weigh in on maybe you want to ask Anthea, given the difficulty, what you're writing about white evangelical racism, but also your position as co-chair of Catholics for Biden, do you have a sense that the Catholic Church offers a better prospect at the moment for the Black population than evangelical Protestantism?
No, as a Black Catholic, let me be blunt, no. I mean, and without, let me put it this way. I mean, we have our own internal internecine battle going on between, traditional Catholics and, middle of the road, or what we would call maybe liberal Catholics, right? And that has a lot to do with whether you fall on the side of, do you think Francis is right? Do you think Pope Benedict is right? Who do you think is the right person to follow? And, I think one of the things that has happened that's really bad in the American context is that we have priests and bishops who are willing to weigh in on this election and forgetting that they had a document called Faithful Citizenship to talk about how to vote and to, vote according to your conscience and not have people tell you how to vote, because that's not the role of the Catholic Church. And I think what has been very interesting to me in this election cycle is that this is not the JFK election cycle where we have to legitimize a man who's Catholic that's running for president. What's been more interesting is the sloppiness in which Trump wants to deal with it. So, Trump has been really sloppy because he keeps saying, well, he wants to get rid of God and everything else. And I'm like, dude, you don't even know how to shoot your shot right, okay? Because you could just go for all the anti-Catholic stuff, just like you go for all the anti-Semitic stuff, and you can have an argument. But you don't even know how to make that argument, which tells you that he doesn't understand religion, because he doesn't even know how to make the regular arguments. So when he does the things like he holds up the Bible in front of a church or whatever, these are supposed to be things that he thinks are going to, rile up the evangelicals. In the meantime, the Catholics are over here fighting this battle. And the only thing that, I'm not going to say this is the only thing that they care about, but they care about the pro-life issue, right? And so, I think what we've not paid attention to are a couple of things. One is the internecine battles of what Catholics are having. And that second, Catholics have their own Fox TV, and that's called ETWN, Eternal Word Network. And that has been very conservative, and people like Raymond Arroyo and others are on that network promoting a certain kind of Catholicism that is, more akin to the kind of thing that you would think that meshes in very well with authoritarian regimes. I'll put it like that. And so I think that this is where, the press hasn't really paid attention to this as much as they could. And I think as scholars, we need to pay attention to where this battle is sort of, happening in the places where it makes tension. Down the road from you, Father Jenkins is getting over his coronavirus, but because of the way he decided to handle that whole thing with Amy Coney Barrett, he ended up getting a lot of egg on his face. And so now there's two competing visions of what Notre Dame is, right? And that's political, and that's also religious. And so now you have to think about what that means for that institution. So I think these are the kinds of ways in which this election cycle has complicated Catholicism in some different ways that people were not expecting.
Yes. Yeah. Rick.
I'm sorry. I really want to agree with Anthea on that, and just add this footnote, which is, I think that part of the answer to Wilhelmine's question is a question of church leadership. And if you go back to the late 1980s when Joseph Cardinal Bernardin was still alive and articulated the seamless garment of life argument, one of the chief reactions you had to that among Catholics was, well, how do we vote? Because what Bernardin said is, life is precious, and that involves not just abortion, it involves war, it involves incarceration, it involves the death penalty. And you had a Catholic leader who was willing to say that church values are not simply applied to voting one way or the other. I think what we've seen since his death, literally, in the American church leadership is exactly the bifurcation that Anthea is talking about, because people are not willing to acknowledge that there is not an immediate connect between a doctrinal statement and pulling the lever in a voting booth. And I think if American religion is going to recover a role in our political life, it's going to have to accede to the idea that it can't tell people that there's a one-to-one between dogma and voting. Faithful Citizenship is the document that the bishops put out about voting, right? Go look at the 2019 version of that. I was reading it this afternoon. I try to avoid this document, but I do read it. And it's very interesting. They quote Pope Francis, who sounds an awful lot like Cardinal Bernardin, and then immediately move to abortion. You know, it's really interesting. So you get this beautiful statement, very Bernardine-esque statement from Francis about, look, you know, there are huge issues related to life. They have to do with economics. They have to, you know, long list of things that would come under the banner of I value life. They have this block quote, and then immediately they say, of course, abortion is the most important example of this issue. I mean, that's, to my mind at least, an example of how to diminish the religious institution's authority ultimately, because it becomes one issue voting right away. And then the kinds of pressures that Kristen are talking about in her denomination come to the fore. What are people going to do when life is much more complex than your religion will allow it to be?
Thank you. At this moment, I think I'm going to ask Daniel to come on because there are some questions from the audience that he will put to you.
Hello. Thank you all so much for a stimulating discussion. We have a few questions here from the audience. Martha Christian Green asks, I have heard distinctions made between the terms racial conciliation, reconciliation, healing, justice, and other terms. Could the panelists discuss how these terms are being used in their traditions? Some terms are said to be more appropriate for some contexts than others. That was an early question. I think it may have the conversation may have moved on from there, but that was an early question.
Yeah, let me just put it this way. I don't know if it's going to answer your question perfectly, but I think the terminologies where they get used of reconciliation, conciliation, healing, justice, all of these things have one really big problem with it, and that is that they don't move into into the structural move about what we need to do about racism. It's always in this feeling moment and an affective moment in which something needs to happen. We have a service, we have this, we have a statement, we have whatever, and then things kind of go back to usual. And so that's, for me, is the biggest issue with all of this, is that we can have these sorts of events that happen, but the structural issues are never addressed about how that racism has occurred, what we might do to fix that, how might we, do restitution. Those kind of things never get talked about. It's always this feeling or affective way of doing it. And so that, for me, is the issue with all of this. And I think that until we begin to really start to talk about the kinds of ways in which, there's restitution, where there's change, where there's, dismantling of systems, let's put it like that, then I think that that's going to mean that moves forward to something else altogether, rather than just these shows and displays of what we think works.
It matches how we talk about it at Sojourners. There's no healing without resistance. There's no reconciliation without restitution. So without attention to the structural pieces. And the difficult question becomes when's the last time a group gave up power willingly? And of course, the Christian faith has an individual who did that, and a particular act on the cross, as it were, for our theology. But until you attend to those things, it's window dressing. It's easy to move on to the next thing. So yeah, no thanks for the quick healing.
Mm-hmm. All right, we can move on to the next question. This is from Jill Waite. Have we any data about the percentage of Catholics who vote one issue, usually abortion, and Catholics who understand the statements of the USCCB and the Pope on voting for the person who is more likely to foster life broadly? That is, who are for the candidate more likely to fight poverty, redlining, and other very serious social issues, even if the candidate is pro-choice, but also enriching life after safe birth.
I'd have to
That's a good question.
Go ahead, Anthea.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that's a great question. I don't have the numbers on this, but I do think, the question becomes is who's the one issue voter versus the person who is voting on a variety of issues and not just like the theological ones. I mean, I think one of the things that we, those of us who are in the business sort of think about is that, oh, wow, theology is going to be the thing that gets us through. But in reality, most people are not thinking theologically, they're thinking politically, right? And they're thinking about how are my friends voting and how's everybody else voting. And I just find that I think that the polls don't really get at some of the nuances that we want them to get at. And I'd be interested to hear what Rick has to say about this, but I feel like, especially polling with Catholics, to me, is just really bad right now. And I want somebody to do something very different. Let me put it like that. Yeah. And that's all I'll say.
Yeah. No, I'm afraid I don't have an answer for Anthea, but I would affirm what she says. I mean, I think if you look at past elections, the relentlessness of the 40-40-20 paradigm is quite amazing, actually. I mean, it's there everywhere. And the only moral that anybody draws from it, and this will be cold comfort to my dear friend Jill, is that Catholics vote with their pocketbooks. That's to say that the more affluent they become, the more conservative they become. I don't know that that's true, and I would like to see polling that got at that a little more adequately than what I've seen. But if you buy the 40-40-20 paradigm, that's what you get. That as Catholics become more affluent, they become more conservative. And so they're not voting on their religion. That's what you get. But I would really want to underscore what Anthea said, which is that I don't know that we have good data there at all.
It's hard to come by, but in general, as we say, Catholics are more aligned with their political party than the teachings of their church.
Oh, definitely.
Which is that. So 77% of Democratic-leaning Catholics believe abortion should be legal in all or most cases. Yes. And then 63% of Republicans and Republican-leaning Catholics say abortion should be illegal in most cases. And then finally, 62% of Catholics believe the church should butt out of politics, which is intriguing. But, I'd like to confirm what Anthea and Rick were saying, a much better articulation of the Catholic world that I could do. But in the last couple of years, I've had time to spend time one-on-one with Cardinal Vigano, Cardinal Koch, and Cardinal McCarrick. And you couldn't have three more different articulations of how a person might vote after you sat down with the three of those guys. So,
I commend you for even speaking to Vigano.
It was at his house. And it was just about 10 minutes, and it was hard, and it was before things broke. So I wouldn't have known about Kentucky Saul before that. But so I don't get that much credit.
Excellent. We've had a number of questions about sort of in the area of women voters and also women evangelical voters, and also is there a secret comeback happening? So Natalia Marandiuk asks, to what extent do any of you see at least a subterranean trend among white evangelical women to subvert the narratives of authoritarian masculinity by left-shifting voting choices in light of the privacy of the voting gesture? Similar question from Charlotte Long. I'm wondering if the panel has any thoughts about the idea that perhaps white evangelicals might feel anything about potential new awareness of racism, and if that might be a reason for the slight dip in evangelical support for Trump.
I'll talk about white evangelical women to start. And we do see in white evangelical voting patterns similar to non-white evangelical voting patterns that women are somewhat less likely to support Trump and to vote for him. That said, they are still much more likely than other women to vote for Trump. And that this is a narrative that journalists love to kind of chase, because I think many of us would want to believe that this is the case. And so you can find, if you Google, a number of stories that are suggesting and have been suggesting for the past 4.5 years that white evangelical women are going to break from Trump and going to, change the results. And the evidence for that tends to be 2 or 3 anecdotes. And so I would say, be very cautious about that narrative, which is probably more hopeful thinking, wishful thinking, than it is really looking at the data. Again, we do see gender play a role, a small role in terms of evangelical women are slightly less likely to support Trump, but in the single digits. And just to keep in mind that women can support patriarchy too, and that women's support for patriarchy is absolutely essential to perpetuating patriarchy. So some caveats there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with what Kristen said. And I'm going to go a little bit further and say, I'm sorry, I just remember that sign from the women's rally on election day, on inauguration day, where you said, just remember white women voted for Trump. And I'm like, I don't trust the ballot box. I don't trust that they're going to be, sincere about what they do, because I think that, if this boils down to the kinds of issues like law and order, are my kids going to get a job? Are we going to still be able to be on top, et cetera, I expect them to go in there and vote for Trump. I just do. And I wish I didn't believe that. But yeah, I don't see them as being, maybe the group that I want to look at that might change their mind for Trump. I hope I'm wrong. But and I'll be the first one to say if I'm wrong and the numbers come out on the other side, I will say, gee, I was wrong. I really was. But right now, I don't feel that way.
Other than anecdotal, all we have is a little bit of data on Mormon women, but that doesn't take anything away from what Anthea and Kristen just said. If anything, that rarity confirms it.
A question from Bill Schweiker. Maybe all of the confusion here is that the social order is more differentiated. Civic institutions, economy, education, media, medical, etc., in ways that complicates how religious belief and practices express themselves in the social order. As a question, how do the panelists think about the expression of religion in different social subsystems?
Well, I have a lot of sympathy with the question. I probably should go first since I was the one who got on my soapbox about religious leadership. I think that, what I believe what I said, which is that I think religious leaders, if religion is going to continue to matter, they have to relinquish a kind of one-to-one correspondence between what they say and what they expect people to do. But I'll go a little bit farther and say, for instance, that in the city of Chicago, I think one of the things the Archdiocese ought to do is rethink the organization of parishes with race and economics in line, in fully, on their frontal lobe, because it is really amazing how, amazing in one sense, unsurprising in another, how quickly churches organize around those social stratifications. So I think what I would say to my colleague's excellent question is I think that there has to be, on the one hand, the leadership has to relinquish a certain kind of desire to control from the top down, but it also has to act locally in terms of its organization and whatnot to combat the systemic social orders, or to disrupt them, or to complicate them in some way. And I think that's a place to start. I don't think that's a whole answer to the question. It's a place to start. In one way, be a lot less ambitious, and in another way, be much more ambitious than they ever have been.
The things related to the question of a differentiated social world. One thing that I think that makes possible is for certain people to compartmentalize beliefs that might otherwise seem irrational or even abhorrent. You can see with something like the Q movement, which has spread so rapidly over the past couple years, the way people can hold on to ideas which on the face of it seem quite absurd, would seem almost lunatic, but are in most other ways seemingly well-adjusted, normal people. The differentiation of the social world allows, I think, for the spread of these sort of ideas in many ways, by making it possible for people to hold up, to have a world where they hold on to these beliefs, and then another world where they go about their business interacting, perhaps as if these beliefs did not apply. So, and I think that's part of the broader question of what community looks like in this world of social media and those sort of connections, the various sub-communities that can emerge within the broader community, and how those sub-communities can sometimes nurture very toxic ideals.
I think I would also say that within white evangelicalism, where we've seen religious leadership, right? We've seen this mobilization over decades. We've seen it through popular culture, through organizations, alliances, the kind of pipeline from religious leadership through, pastors into churches, into the congregations, through bulletin inserts, right? I mean, they've done this very well, and direct mail and televangelism, right? We've got this whole system here, and it's a comprehensive ideology. And so it tells you exactly what you should think in terms of foreign policy, in terms of euthanasia, in terms of healthcare, in terms of abortion, in terms of schooling, right? It's all there. And that's why, any one issue, say abortion, is a facet of this larger constellation of issues. And so abortion is a very important one because it gives moral cover to all of the other issues, right? Immigration, border wall, things like that too. But so it gives moral cover to this entire ideology. And so the decisions are made, the decisions are handed to you. They're very clear, right versus wrong, good versus bad, Republican versus Democrat. So we're at the point where you can't really address any issue. You can't really break that off. And I would suggest that even if you could somehow wave a magic wand and take abortion completely off the table in 2020, you would see almost no movement in terms of the white evangelical vote, because it is but a facet of this larger, very coherent ideology.
I think the closest I could get to Professor Schweiker's complex question, it just reminds me of another question, so that's the closest I'll get. Basically, if the selfish individual can defeat the altruistic individual, but the selfish group loses to the altruistic group because it implodes, then the altruistic group can beat the selfish group. Then we have to find a way to widen the circle of the altruistic group. The question for me then, which I think I'm reminded of with this question, is how do we increase the altruistic group? And the worst case is, what if having a group to oppose is the basis of a strong identity, meaning, and faith? In other words, must we have an out and an in because boundaries and barriers, kind of like human skin, define what is and what is not this identity and meaning? How do we widen the circle of we, and what if that reduces our sense of community because opposition strengthens identity and groupness? So those are just the questions that remind me of your question, but I don't really have a great answer to your question. Yeah.
Can I just comment on that question about, social subsystems and orders? Let me put it this way, which is a much starker way to put it. If the social order is constructed on whiteness, then that's the thing that runs everything, right? Then it doesn't really matter how the social order is differentiated, because it's always going to be predicated on this particular group of people who sort of order everything, right? So I think that question I would rephrase in a profoundly different way, is to say, how is the social order breaking down as a result of white supremacy and all of these things that have now been revealed because nobody was paying attention to before? And the reason why I say that is, the moment of George Floyd being having the knee knelt upon him and that going around on TV all of the time. And nobody was there 6 years ago when Mike Brown happened. As I told people, I was like, I got tired of writing about this because, like basically it was like screaming into the whirlwind where people were paying attention and weren't paying attention, and certain people were paying attention. And then when it became George Floyd, everybody paid attention and everybody started scrambling because they knew that this was a horrible moment. And so I would say that the social order of America is based on violence and subjugation of people of color. And I'm just going to be sorry about that. That's the way it is. And this is what our history is. And so when you ask questions about social order, you just need to understand that your social order is not the social order that the rest of us want to have.
Maybe I can ask each of you at this point to kind of have a closing statement in the sense that we're about the public understanding of religion as the Marley Center. It's not a great state of religion that we're in at the moment. If I go around the virtual table that we're sitting at, what do you think we should watch for in the coming years? This election will happen and we all hope for the best outcome, but what should we watch for? Where do you see possible kind of evolutions happening? Change of some kind in religious terms on the horizon?
I'm happy to start first because
yes.
I will tell you right now that everything that's happening, there is one thing that is the great leveler, and that is the coronavirus. Yes. The coronavirus is going to upend everything about religion in this country. And we're not paying attention to it right now, but Christian churches have been a vector for the virus. Yeah. It is spreading in lots of different places. We have this idea about religious freedom being, I don't have to wear a mask and I can go to church and I can sit by everybody and do all this, but it's killing people. And so the combination of the virus and the virus, running through churches and running through religious organizations. And I'm not just talking about Christians here. We can talk about Orthodox till the cows come home. I mean, we had like a huge, rally in New York where somebody actually got beat up over the weekend. Maybe it's past week, 2 weekends ago, about, trying to get the Haredi community in line in terms of coronavirus. I think this is going to change everything. And I think that we're going to start seeing numbers of people falling out. We're going to see a lot of churches closing. We're going to see a lot of religious organizations having to realign themselves. And this question about evangelicals and politics is going to resolve itself because people are going to start to turn away from all that, not just because they're disillusioned with it, but because they don't have to go any place anymore because they can watch it all on TV.
Mm. Yeah, I think you're very right. We haven't yet touched on the coronavirus. It was on my mind, actually. I heard today my sister has corona. And,
oh, wow.
And so, it's preoccupying all of us. But I think you're very right that it's affecting the churches in massive ways that we don't quite see yet or understand. Rob, may I ask you so I'm just going around the table and asking everybody for their closing words.
Sure. So a couple quick thoughts. One is where the none of the above's vote matters. I talked about the 3 states already that Trump won with them. What is the none of the above heading to if it's 25% of the U.S.? The second, to answer one of the questions in the chat, is this, my second point, which is 7% of the U.S. population now is not none of the above and not Christian. So 5% of those split towards Republican, 9 Democrat, thus 5 and 9 and 7. That's another big story to track. The other one is the Johnson Amendment. We know it as the 501c3 rules, where you can't support a candidate in any form. President Trump set out in 2017 an executive order which he thought would crush the Johnson Amendment to drop that line between supporting a candidate and religious organizations. The Justice Department wrote back and said that's not going to work. But how the Johnson Amendment and our understanding of religious free expression is going to be critical. And then finally, elections pull us together, if not bind us together, for basically kind of like a national moment. And those are few and far between, given what Professor Schweiker mentioned and all kinds of other differentiation. So for some, the American experiment is too tainted to ever become redemptive, basically, or salvageable. And debates ensue about how much to improve incrementally. But tracking those debates in the past, W.E.B. Du Bois and Marcus Garvey, Malcolm and Martin before Mecca and the Riverside speech, James Baldwin, Angela Davis, and so forth, Maybe you could say it's Kanye and Cornell. I don't know how to keep the alliteration there, but is the American experiment too tainted? And then how do you gain hope? Because it's very possible to express similar values in a nearly diametrically opposed manner in an election. We believe in the sacredness of life. Yeah, well, the execution of those similar values looks very different publicly in those elections. So screaming louder that your side has the true ethic of sacredness of life leaves us all with depleted vocal cords. But we're gonna have to figure out some of these four things that I just mentioned, but it'll be no doubt interesting.
Thank you. Kristen, may I ask you for some comments?
Yeah, I think building on what Anthea was saying, both in light of the disruptions of the coronavirus and ongoing disruptions to religious gatherings and, life and death issues that more people are facing, and in light of the last 4 years of the Trump administration and particularly white Christians' complicity in this administration, I think we are in an unprecedented moment, at least in my lifetime, of people no longer being complacent about their beliefs, no longer being complacent about religion in general. I think that is a time of profound questioning. And so an exciting time perhaps for scholars of religion, because people are not just asking what they believe, they are also asking what is religion? Like what does religion do? What is the connection between belief and personal belief and the world? And so it is an exciting time, a dynamic time, to be asking these questions and to be observing how people are going about answering them, precisely because it is such a time of disruption.
Thank you. Well, Will, as an incoming faculty member, it's an exciting time for religion. What do you see on the horizon?
Well, I can make 2 points, totally unrelated to one another, but hopefully they will still be worthwhile. Someone in the Q&A raised the comparison between Joe Biden's battle for the soul of America and a much earlier invocation, not much earlier, but an earlier invocation of that term by Pat Buchanan, the conservative ideologue and commentator in 1992 in his culture war speech at the Republican National Convention, when he also spoke of a war for the soul of America. And the fact that two people as politically different as Biden and Buchanan, though I guess it is worth noting that both are Catholic, could invoke this language of battle and of warfare shows the utility of this kind of language still in American politics. So one of the things I'll be curious to see is what kind of metaphors do religious figures and religiously inflected politicians use in the years ahead? Are we still going to be talking in terms of battles and wars? And is there a possibility for perhaps politicians, perhaps ministers, to put forward a different kind of metaphor? Obviously, metaphors are not going to change everything or even a lot of things, but I think they're still important for thinking about how politics is structured. The second point would just be that it's important to think about, to go beyond the presidential election and to look at what is happening at the local level, at the state level, even at the city or the county level, because I think that's where the alliances and the coalitions and the policies that are going to shape future forms of religious engagement will happen. In many ways, I think this election is kind of an old battle being fought on a rapidly changing landscape. Mm-hmm. And what that landscape will look like is not going to be determined by Trump or Biden, but what happens in, say, the county commissions of growing suburbs, or in the city councils, or in the state legislatures, Arizona or Nevada. I think that is where students of religion and politics should look.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And finally, Rick, may I ask for you?
Sure. So this inflects a little bit on some of the earlier comments. I want to talk about age. We have two presidential candidates who are in their 70s. The leading contenders for the Democratic nomination were just over 70 as well. We have a Supreme Court whose justices are largely quite old. We are living in a society where we have longer lifespans than we've ever had, and people hang on to jobs tenaciously. And I think one of the big things to watch in the future is what's going to happen with that. And I do not exempt the academy and the church from this, just to be clear. I think that, there's the way I would put it is I think there's been a reluctance for people to hand over power for too long. And something's going to have to happen with that one way or another. And who emerges from this? I think, for instance, the reception of the Gang of Four in Congress was a real index of this. It was an index of other things too, of race, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that these young women could come into the Congress, I mean, the word young mattered there in a way that I think is important. So I think one of the things we're going to need to watch is what happens generationally. When do people finally give up their leadership, and who steps in, and what discrepancies or differences are there between them, if any?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think we've come to the end of the webinar. I want to thank all the panelists, as I also asked them to at least unmute themselves, because otherwise they will be heard by everyone as we sign off. I want to again profusely apologize to the audience and also to Professor Anthea Butler for the terrible chat. It's just marked this event a little bit for me. But all the more thanks to all of you for your willingness to engage, because it's an extremely important topic. And as I told some of you, our wonderful Institute of Politics does a lot of events, but they don't touch on religion. And religion is such an important factor in these elections. And as Will said, not just the presidential election, but down ballot as well. So with that, my profound thanks to everybody in the audience also who wrote questions and participated. Read our citings columns where we will continue to cite religion for you, and we hope to see you at future events. And by all means, vote. The sooner the better, I would say. Thank you.